Hi everyone, and welcome to another video in the Historically Accurate Panzer 46 series. In these videos, I talk about what vehicles would have been on the battlefield had the Second World War gone on for several months or even several years longer. Unlike German Wunderwaffen, which are generally based on napkin sketches and various unrealized concepts, the Allies actually had quite a lot of tanks that were ready almost in time before the end of the Second World War, and as a result went on to become foundations for very successful Cold War tank series, such as the Pershing, which begat the Patton series, the T-54 and T-55, and the British Centurion. In this video, I'm going to focus on the Soviet T-54 tank. Now, the first thing you might ask is, well, how can the T-54, a tank made in 1954, be a Second World War tank? Well, this is, for some reason, a question that I get fairly frequently, and the answer was the number in the name T-54 has absolutely nothing to do with the year it was put into service or put into production. Just like the T-34 was accepted into service in 1939 and not 1934, and the T-70 was accepted into service in 1942 and not 1970, the T-54 was actually put into or ordered into production in 1945 and accepted into service in 1946. So the number is just a sequential index. It doesn't mean anything. If you're interested, I have a whole post about this and Ask Historians. I'm going to link it in the description below. All right, let's get to the history of the T-54. We'll have to rewind back a couple of years to go all the way back to 1941. The thing is that the Red Army was very well aware of the T-34's shortcomings, and work to replace it actually began in 1941. Introduction of the T-34M was planned for August of that year, and if Germany hadn't invaded, well, the T-34 would have been just a footnote. But as it was, all prospective tank projects were put on hold in June of 1941, and so the T-34M died. However, the idea of replacing the T-34 did not, and so in 1942, work began on a tank called T-43 that would have replaced the T-34. Unfortunately, work on the T-43 dragged on and on and on, and by the time the tank had passed trials in the summer of 1943, the Battle of Kursk had happened, and at the Battle of Kursk, a number of German vehicles were revealed that essentially suggested the existing concept of a Soviet medium tank was no longer up to par. And so since there's not really a point in building a medium tank that no longer meets your requirements, the very difficult decision to shelve the T-43 had to be made. The new tank, in order to fight the Tiger, well, and to a greater extent the Panther, it had to have an 85mm gun, and it had to have 90mm of frontal armor. There was a mock-up made that introduced all of these features into the T-43, and the design showed that it was possible. However, the resulting tank would have weighed around 35-36 tons. This would have likely overloaded the T-43's chassis, and, well, the Red Army really wanted to keep its medium tanks below 30 tons, but realistically, the weight limit was set 33-34 tons. And so the upgraded T-43 was a non-starter. The only way to meet the Red Army's new requirements was to introduce a radical new tank. This tank would weigh only 30 tons, and it would have an 85mm gun and 90mm of frontal armor. This new tank was called T-44. Work on the T-44 began very quickly, and prototypes were ready for testing in January of 1944. However, two major issues delayed its acceptance into service. The first one was that several iterations of prototypes were needed. While the tanks tested in the winter of 1944 did have all of the revolutionary features that were required to build this new generation of medium tank, they really needed quite a bit more work before they were battle-worthy. The other major issue was that a decision was made to put this tank into production at factory number 75, which, until fairly recently at that point, lay in ruins after German occupation. This was a conscious decision because all of the other tank factories were busy building T-34-85 tanks, and reducing the output of T-34-85s was considered unacceptable. Nevertheless, this resulted in the first T-44s only being delivered in November of 1944, and those tanks were really only suitable for training. It wouldn't be until much later that T-44 tanks would actually be battle-worthy. Unfortunately for the T-44, Even in November of 1944, the tank looked to be a little bit long in the tooth. The problem was the introduction of the King Tiger tank. This tank was discovered by Soviet forces in the late summer, early fall of 1944, and it brought two very important things: the battlefield, thicker armor, and a more powerful gun. And so the Red Army's next generation medium tank had to have something to counter that, which meant its thicker armor of its own and a more powerful gun of its own. Thankfully, such a gun existed. That was the 100mm D10T, developed at factory number 9, originally for heavy tanks. And actually, work on this gun, to put this gun in T-44, began in the summer of 1944, before the Red Army would possibly have heard of the King Tiger. So you had this kind of modernization going on even as T-44 prototypes were still being tested. So the concept of what would later become the T-54, but at that point was still called T-44B, was starting to form by the late summer, early fall of 1944. In addition to having a more powerful gun, the armor of the tank was reinforced quite considerably. So the front of the hull, instead of 90mm, would now be 120, sloped at 60 degrees. And the front of the turret would be 180mm. The sides at the front would be 150mm, and it would thin out towards the back to a thickness of 90mm. This kind of variable thickness casting really saved a lot of weight, and so this tank would have truly revolutionary levels of protection at considerably reduced weight compared to the heavy tanks at the time. One issue, of course, is that this kind of solution still resulted in increased weight because more steel does make your tank heavier. And the tank had to be widened because the fighting compartment required to accommodate the larger 100mm gun had to be wider, and of course, the bigger your tank, the more armor you need to enclose it, and the heavier the weight. And so the weight of the tank climbed until it hit about 36 tons, which is, well, back at the same level the T-43 would have been, except still with more armor and with a more powerful gun. At this point, this was considered a worthwhile alternative. Of course, changes had to be made to the design to accommodate that weight. In part, the road wheels were made wider in order to reduce the wear on the rubber rims. And actually, gradually, the entire running gear was redesigned. So if you look at a T-44 and a T-54, the running gear is very, very different. Or if you look at a T-34-85 and a T-54, the running gear is very different. And well, speaking of the name T-54, around this time, the index T-54 was introduced around November of 1944, although the name T-44B still continued to be used for quite some time. Production of parts for the newly christened T-54 began in November of 1944, and assembly began in early 1945. Assembly of the first prototype of the T-54 was completed by February 14th, 1945. And then the tank was put through fairly limited factory trials. Even at this point, it was obvious that it was much more promising than the T-44, and so the T-54's trials were expedited, and it was arrived in Kubinka and began trials by March 11th. The extra 3 tons, give or take, of weight didn't go unnoticed, and of course the T-34-85 was a little bit faster than its successor. Its top speed was 10 kilometers per hour faster, and the average speed was 2 kilometers per hour faster. But nevertheless, the T-54 did put out speed that was good enough for a medium tank. And most importantly, even though it was heavier than its predecessor, the reliability was not impacted that much. So quite a promising design. As trials often do, a number of suggestions were given, including probably the most important and most visible one, the replacement of the turret. The turret originally was designed to follow in the footsteps of the IS-6 tank, which was a failed prototype tested in late 1944. In 1945, the Trials Commission recommended that the IS-3 example be followed, so the bowl-shaped turret most commonly associated with Soviet Cold War-era tanks. Despite these changes, this tank was considered to be very promising, and the order to put it into production was given on May 5th, 1945. a little bit before VE Day, but the Red Army did accept a medium tank into service that could punch way above its weight and actually, it could fight the King Tiger more or less as an equal, despite weighing 36 tons as opposed to the King Tiger's almost 70. However, not everything was so fortunate for the T-54. As I mentioned, after VE Day, the requirement to fight King Tigers somehow went away. And in July of 1945, Factory 183 changed its priority from wartime production to peacetime production. In particular, the goal that was given to them was to copy and put into production the American Mac NR heavy truck. Of course, that meant that work on the T-54 basically stopped. This tank, that was a huge revolutionary step forward, well, it wasn't really needed anymore. Japan could be defeated with a T-34-85, and since the USSR needed to rebuild after a devastating war, well, nobody was really thinking about tank production that much. Even though the T-54 was deprioritized, it didn't die completely. A second prototype was assembled from existing parts and underwent testing in the summer of 1945, and what's called unofficially the T-54 model 1946 was in fact accepted into service in 1946. However, production was fairly in very small amounts. Changes were in very small amounts, and so improvements requested by the Commission in 1945 weren't really completely implemented until 1949, including the bowl-shaped turret. However, that was all because of the changes in priority. As you can see from the expedition of trials in the spring of 1945 and the order to put the tank into production just a few short months later, the Red Army had high hopes for the T-54. They were fully prepared to sacrifice T-34-85 production for it. And had the war gone on for a couple more months or a couple more years, the Red Army would have had a medium tank on the battlefield that was more than capable of handling any armor the Germans could have theoretically put out